Ready for a deep dive into Yuji Krishnamurti? This one is interesting because we've got a real mix of sources, journal entries, philosophical excerpts, even some transcripts from his talks.
Wow. Yeah, that's right. Somebody really wants to understand him, huh?
Yeah, it seems like they're looking for something beyond just like a regular biography.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're going to really try to get to the bottom of what made Yuji tick, explore the core of his, well, he wouldn't call it a teaching, more like an anti-teaching.
Right. That's Yuji for you.
Exactly. And hopefully leave you with some, thought-provoking questions to ponder.
Sounds good to me. Where do we start?
Let's start with Julie Thayer's journal entries. They give us such a candid, almost like fly-on-the-wall view of Yuji's daily life
Mm.
and his, well, unique personality.
Yeah, those are really fascinating, very revealing.
For example, right when he arrives, he declares he'll be staying for 40 days and 40 nights,
Oh, wow.
instantly invoking like that biblical imagery.
Right.
Is he setting the stage for a transformation?
Could be. Or knowing Yuji, maybe it's more like a test.
A test, right? Like he's going to challenge everyone around him.
Absolutely. And then he kind of blows that whole idea up later by saying, we can only experience things through the lens of what we already know. So much for transformation, right?
That's right. There's a lot of those kinds of contradictions with Yuji. Then there's the time he gets pickpocketed, and instead of being angry, he admires the thief's skill. He even says he wishes he could take the guy out for a fancy lunch.
Classic Yuji, right? He completely flips our expectations. He's not attached to material possessions, and he sees right through our emotional reactions. He'd say it's all just a bunch of falsehoods, you know?
So it's not really about the stolen wallet at all. It's about Yuji rejecting, like our whole system of values.
Exactly. He's demonstrating a different way of being in the world, a way that's free from the grip of what he calls thought.
Which brings us to another one of those quirks, sound. He doesn't seem to differentiate between, say, Beethoven's Ninth and the drone of an air conditioner.
Right. There's no hierarchy of experience for him. Like, he's completely unfazed by the things we as a society consider high culture or whatever.
It's like he's trying to wake us up from this dream we're all living in.
Yeah, a dream where we assign all these arbitrary values to things, and those values create all kinds of, hierarchies and attachments.
Okay, so then Julie describes his really strange sleep patterns. He curls up in the fetal position, only sleeps for these short bursts, almost like entering a death-like state.
Makes you wonder, was that purely physiological or was there something deeper going on?
I mean, he did talk about this calamity he experienced, this
Mhm.
event that totally changed his biological functioning.
Right, and he insists that it wasn't some kind of spiritual awakening, but this fundamental shift in his being, what he called the natural state.
And you see this reflected in how he interacts with people.
Yeah.
Julie mentions these really blunt assessments he would make. Like, he calls out perhaps disgust as actually being envy. He makes comments about Frank's drinking. He even calls Charity vicious.
Yeah, and it's not about being mean, it's about exposing this gap between how we see ourselves and how we actually are. And that can be really unsettling, but also really liberating.
Like he's holding up a mirror and saying, take a good look. This is you.
And very few of us want to really look.
But then he does these completely unpredictable things, like out of nowhere, he suggests Julie stay in Delhi to go sightseeing. It's so detached.
He was constantly challenging the people around him, pushing them out of their comfort zones, making them confront their own motivations.
Trying to figure out, are they really interested in him or just looking for another guru?
Yeah, and that becomes a big part of Julie's journey, this whole struggle with attachment and figuring out who she is without Yuji.
And then he describes traveling with him as excruciatingly personal, almost like some kind of test.
The crucible, yeah.
He even tells this anecdote about a lunar eclipse and, his child's penis. It's meant to be shocking.
He was not afraid to provoke, to break social taboos, to make people uncomfortable.
Yeah, he was definitely a disruptor.
And not always in a pleasant way.
That's for sure. Then there's this really weird incident where he tells Mahesh that Mahesh is on his side. So cryptic.
He was full of those kinds of pronouncements, always leaving people guessing.
But amidst all of this intensity, you also see these moments of simplicity. Like, he's happy wearing his old laceless shoes, content with very little.
Yeah, he found joy in the most ordinary things. It's like he was showing us that happiness doesn't have to be complicated.
And yet he was always pushing Julie, asking her, why do you want to be with me? And what are you doing to make that possible? He even dismisses love as a reason.
He was looking for something deeper than just devotion. He wanted her to be self-aware, to face the reality of their situation without any romantic illusions.
It's like he was saying, if you really want to be with me, you have to let go of everything you think you know.
Yeah, including the idea of love itself.
Which brings us to the incident where he suddenly packs up and leaves Australia. It's a huge turning point for Julie. She's forced to confront her own life, her own needs, instead of relying on UG for answers.
He was always doing things like that, throwing people back on themselves, refusing to play the guru role.
Right, which connects to another one of his big ideas, the idea that one can only experience the known. It seems to go against everything we think we know about growth and expansion and enlightenment.
Great. He's saying all that seeking is just a distraction. We're always filtering reality through our existing knowledge, so what's the point of trying to get beyond it?
It's a pretty radical shift in perspective, and it's one that Julie really struggles with.
As most of us would. It challenges everything we've been taught about spirituality and self-improvement.
And we see this again in the cooking incident with Bodil. Yuji seems to be pushing Julie to get over her need to be needed.
Again, refusing to be put on a pedestal. He wanted her to find a sense of self that wasn't dependent on taking care of others.
So independence was really important to him.
Absolutely. He saw dependence as a form of weakness, a way of avoiding responsibility for our own lives.
Even emotional reactions were met with this kind of challenge. When Julie reacts to being left out of a drive, Yuji basically tells her to go to New York.
He had zero tolerance for what he saw as emotional reactivity. He wanted people to face reality directly, without all the drama.
So even emotions were seen as a kind of illusion.
Not an illusion, but a product of thought, a conditioned response that clouds our perception. He wasn't saying we should suppress our emotions, but we shouldn't let them control us.
Wow. It's definitely a different way of looking at things.
And that was Yuji's whole point, wasn't it? To challenge our assumptions, to shake things up, to make us see the world in a new way.
Now that we've gotten a sense of Yuji through Julie's eyes, I think it's time we hear from the man himself.
Let's see what he has to say.
So we've gotten a taste of Yuji through Julie Thayer's eyes. But now, let's dive into his own words. We have some excerpts from his book, No Way Out. And right away he starts by asking, how do we understand this sort of teaching? Like he's acknowledging this paradox right from the get-go.
It's really a brilliant opening, because so many of us are familiar with self-help, spiritual teachings, constantly trying to improve ourselves.
Become enlightened?
Right, striving for something. And Yuji's like, what if that's the problem? What if all that striving is actually what's keeping us stuck?
Yeah, and in a way, he becomes a symbol of seeking itself. So letting go of him, letting go of his teaching, could that be like letting go of seeking altogether?
He's definitely challenging us to do that, to let go of those ingrained patterns, those beliefs about who we are and what we need to become.
Yeah, and he flat out rejects traditional spiritual teachings, saying there's nothing to be transformed in us.
Absolutely. And he goes even further, denying the existence of a permanent self, a fixed I. Remember in Julie's journal, where he talks about only experiencing the known?
Right, so it's like who we think we are is just this collection of thoughts, memories, conditioning, not some solid, unchanging entity.
Exactly. It's all impermanent, always changing. And he uses this great analogy to illustrate his point about seeking ultimate reality. He compares it to missing your train because you're too busy trying to figure out the meaning of the train station.
It's like, dude, just get on the train.
Right. It's a distraction from the practical matter at hand. You're so caught up in the big questions that you miss out on the actual experience of life.
So maybe all those existential questions we get hung up on, they're just keeping us from being present.
That's the implication. And even if we could somehow grasp some ultimate truth, our perception is still filtered through our own conditioning. So even truth becomes another trap.
Another thing to cling to. Okay, so then we have the natural state, which starts with a line that's both beautiful and kind of scary. You will never know what life is.
It really sets the tone for Yuji's whole perspective.
Yeah.
And then he jumps right into this emphasis on the body's intelligence, how it operates independently of our thoughts. He even talks about the role of the ductless glands.
So it's not about controlling our thoughts or striving for mental mastery. He's pointing to something deeper, the wisdom of the body itself.
Exactly. And you think about how much of spirituality and self-help is about controlling your thoughts, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And Yuji flips that on his head. He says thoughts are just tools, They're on demand, they arise in response to situations. Trying to control them is pointless, even harmful.
So we should just let our thoughts do their thing.
Not just thoughts, but the whole organism. Remember, he also says that our senses already have a built-in control mechanism. We don't need to impose any artificial restraints on
It's
ourselves.
like he's saying, just relax, trust your body, it knows what it's doing.
And in that letting go, in that surrender of control, a different kind of consciousness can emerge. Not mystical union, which he rejects, but an undivided consciousness, a state of simply being.
It's hard to even wrap your mind around that.
He admits as much, even saying that you can't understand his message through thought alone. He's not giving us a philosophy to follow, a set of beliefs.
And he really doesn't like it when people come to him looking for solutions or easy answers. He refuses to give them false hope.
He was brutally honest, almost confrontational. He wanted people to see the reality of their situation, even if it was painful.
And then he throws out this totally mind-bending statement. There are no problems, only solutions. It's like turning everything we think we know upside down.
Right. What we perceive as problems are often the result of our trying to fix things or trying to impose order on a universe that's fundamentally chaotic.
So by trying to solve problems, we're actually creating more problems.
In a way, yes. We get so caught up in our own ideas of how things should be that we miss the reality of what is.
And then he goes on to say that anger is inevitable. There's no way to separate ourselves from it.
Which goes against a lot of the self-help stuff out there, right? All that focus on controlling your emotions, positive thinking, all that.
Right, like anger is something to be afraid of, something to avoid.
And Yuji saying, no, it's part of the human experience. Don't try to suppress it, understand it.
Then he drops this bombshell. Kindness as a fine art is a menace to society. Now that's a hard one to swallow.
He's deliberately provocative here. He's critiquing those who preach love and nonviolence, but whose actions are often driven by ego, by a desire to look good, not genuine compassion.
So it's like, don't mistake politeness for kindness. Look at your motives.
Exactly. And he argues that a lot of the destruction in the world has come from people who think they're acting from a place of righteousness. It's a sobering thought.
It makes you question your own motives, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then he takes it even further, suggesting that humanity's destructive tendencies could lead to our own annihilation.
Yeah, he's sounding the alarm, saying that we're on a dangerous path. Our obsession with progress and control might be leading to our downfall.
And then this amazing line. God is the ultimate pleasure, uninterrupted happiness.
Yeah.
No such thing exists.
It's so powerful, right? He's shattering this idea of permanent bliss. We're embodied beings subject to pleasure and pain. That's the reality.
It's the wanting, the clinging to an idea of how things should be that creates suffering.
Exactly. When we demand that reality conform to our expectations, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment.
So true peace comes from accepting what is, not fighting it.
That's the idea. Letting go of the need to control, the need to fix things, accepting ourselves and the world as we are.
It's a radical concept, but it also makes a lot of sense. Then he talks about the cyclical nature of thought, the constant birth and death within the mind.
It's like an invitation to observe our thoughts without getting caught up in them, to see them as passing phenomena, not our true selves.
And when we stop identifying with our thoughts, our senses become more alive, more sensitive.
Like we're freed from this mental armor, able to experience the world directly.
Okay, this next one is a bit of a head-scratcher. He talks about this conflict between the idea of the individual and the impossibility of functioning separately from the totality of human thought. What's he getting at there?
It's complex, but he's basically saying that the self, as we normally think of it, is not this separate entity, but a product of culture, language, shared beliefs.
So we're all interconnected, our minds constantly influencing each other.
Yeah, it's like this web of consciousness. We're all participating in it, shaping and being shaped by it. The idea of a truly autonomous individual is an illusion.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And then he ultimately concludes that thought itself is the enemy of mankind.
He sees it as the root cause of suffering, the barrier between us and reality. Our tendency to overthink, analyze, dissect, it's all creating separation.
And he warns against seeking solace in religion, saying it's not a real solution.
Right. It's another form of seeking, another way to avoid facing the reality of our situation.
He also talks about the pleasure movement, taking a non-judgmental but challenging stance on sex. He even brings up incest to break down our social conditioning.
Again, it's not about endorsing any particular behavior. He's using extreme examples to expose the hypocrisy of our moral codes.
To show that what we consider natural or unnatural is often just based on cultural norms, not some objective truth.
Exactly. He wants us to question everything, even our deepest beliefs about right and wrong.
And in the end, he reiterates that the natural state is not some experience to be attained.
It's simply the functioning of the living organism, the simple act of being, without any striving or seeking. It's what's left when we strip away all the illusions, all the beliefs.
That's a pretty radical concept, challenging everything we thought we knew about ourselves and the world.
And for some, it can be incredibly liberating.
Before we move on to the rest of the sources you shared, I think we need a moment to just sit with this. UG is a lot to take in.
He really is. He's a force of nature, a truth teller. And in a way, he's a kind of antidote to the complacency and self-deception that we often fall into.
Okay, so The Sage and the Housewife offers a slightly different perspective. It has these anecdotes involving Brahmachariji, this former professor of Vedanta.
It's interesting to see Yuji's interactions with him. He seems to have a real fondness for Brahmachariji, despite their philosophical differences.
There's a lightness in these interactions, a playful energy. Yuji even jokes about giving Prashant, somebody's son, a ride on the back of Brahmachariji's bicycle.
And he talks about his love for Udupi restaurants, especially their idli sambar. It's nice to see that side of him, you know?
Right. He's not always this intense, challenging figure. He can be quite funny and down to earth. And speaking of down to earth, the excerpt from Snap Out of It goes back to this idea of us being puppets of nature with no free will.
It's a tough one to accept, but it's consistent with everything else he says. We're biological organisms responding to stimuli in predetermined ways. Even our desires aren't really our own.
So we're not really in control.
Not in the way we think we are. Our conditioning, the culture we're immersed in, it's all shaping our thoughts and actions.
And then he reiterates that point that pleasure is pain for the body.
Not that we should deny ourselves pleasure, but we need to understand that the pursuit of uninterrupted happiness is a fantasy. It's not biologically possible.
In False Perception, he uses this really striking analogy to describe consciousness, an echo chamber.
It's a great image, right? It captures this self-referential nature of thought. Our thoughts are constantly bouncing off each other, creating this illusion of a separate self, a world outside ourselves.
And that echo chamber prevents us from experiencing reality directly. It's like a filter that distorts our perception.
Exactly. We get trapped in our own mental constructs, mistaking them for reality.
Freedom from Illusion and Facing Reality explores a really fascinating link between psychedelic experiences and the origins of religion.
Yeah, he's suggesting that those altered states of consciousness might have inspired people to create belief systems and rituals as a way to recapture those transcendent experiences.
So religion is like a kind of echo of those mystical experiences.
That's the implication. And it raises some really interesting questions about how we make sense of reality and how our attempts to do so can sometimes lead us astray.
Then there's his talk, Meditation is Evil, which, well, I think that title pretty much sums up his view of traditional spiritual practices.
He was a true iconoclast, always challenging the status quo. He questioned everything and refused to play by the rules.
Who are we? What is reality? Really highlights his independent thinking. He's skeptical of both science and religion, refusing to align himself with any particular ideology.
He was encouraging people to think for themselves, to question everything they've been taught, and to come to their own conclusions based on direct experience.
Okay, and this next one is a doozy. In You're Making the Separation, he says that thought itself is leading to the destruction of everything, that human values are false and have falsified our lives.
It's a bold statement, but it fits with his overall message. Our reliance on thought, on our conceptual frameworks, is creating separation and suffering.
And the values we hold dear, the ones that guide our actions, they might be based on illusions, on cultural conditioning that's no longer serving us.
He's calling for a radical reassessment of everything, a questioning of the very foundations of our existence.
Finally, the courage to stand alone focuses on this idea that being truly at peace with oneself can actually make you a threat to society.
It's a paradox, isn't it? True peace, true authenticity, it disrupts the status quo because it challenges the norms, the expectations.
When you're not playing the game anymore, you become an anomaly, a catalyst for change.
And that can be unsettling for those who are still invested in the game, those who benefit from the way things are.
He also describes the natural state in a way that's so different from how we usually think of peace and tranquility. He calls it a volcano constantly erupting.
Such a vivid image, right? It conveys this dynamic, alive quality of true peace. It's not passive or serene. It's a state of constant becoming, radical aliveness.
And he rejects the idea of a silent mind, saying that true silence is the roar of life within.
It's beautiful. True silence isn't an absence of sound, but a fullness of being, an awareness that encompasses everything.
So if we're putting all this together, if thought is the enemy and all our seeking is based on illusion, what are we left with?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Yuji doesn't give us easy answers. He leaves us with questions, challenges, and invitation to explore.
He's asking us to question everything we've been taught, to examine our beliefs and motivations, to see through the illusions that keep us trapped.
And to find the courage to stand alone, to face the unknown without fear, to embrace the radical freedom that comes from letting go.
Yeah, it is a challenge, no doubt. But there's also this, excitement, this possibility of breaking free from all those limitations. All that stuff we've been carrying around in our heads.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like, what's out there? Beyond all our beliefs and assumptions. Pretty tempting to find out.
Right, it's like Yuji's giving us this little peek behind the curtain, showing us there's a whole reality we're not even aware of, just because our minds are, too small to grasp it.
But he's also warning us, like, hey, this is not going to be easy, this journey. It's a lot of courage.
Yeah, you got to be willing to, surrender everything, let go of all the things you're holding on to, even face the void. I mean, he's not giving us a map or a set of instructions.
No, definitely not. It's more like, here's the edge, now jump.
Exactly. He's saying, this is it. This is all there is. Don't try to achieve anything. Just be present. Right here, right now.
Wow.
And that could be, liberating.
Yeah.
Terrifying. Depends on how you look at it.
So what do you think? What do you, the listener, take away from all of this, from this whole deep dive into Yuji? That's a good question. I mean, that's kind of the point, right? He doesn't give us any answers. He just throws out these challenges, these invitations to, explore.
To question everything. Really look at what we believe and why. And try to see through all the illusions that are keeping us stuck.
Yeah. And then, can you stand alone? Can you face all that uncertainty without freaking out? And can you let go of everything you think you know? That's where the real freedom is, according to Yuji.
It's definitely a journey of, self-discovery, of seeing through all the BS and realizing, just how much potential we all have.
Yuji doesn't promise happiness or enlightenment. It's more like he's showing you a glimpse of, true freedom.
The kind of freedom that doesn't depend on anything outside of you.
Right. It's not about your circumstances, your emotions. It's something much deeper.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Yuji Krishnamurti. We explored his teaching, more like his unteaching, really. We looked at his ideas, his personality, and his impact on the people around him.
We talked about that paradox, the whole there's nothing to seek thing, but also this idea of the natural state.
Yuji was definitely a unique figure, a provocateur, a real force of nature. He made people question everything.
And he left us with a lot to think about. These big questions, these challenges, but also this real possibility of waking up from, the dream we're all living in.
He wanted us to see through the illusions, face reality head on, and find the courage to live a life of true freedom. Not an easy task.
Not easy at all. But Yuji might say, what else is there?
Right. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it, insightful, maybe even a little bit unsettling.
Yeah, Yuji has that effect on people.
He definitely does. And hopefully he's inspired you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what you think is possible.